They say history remembers only what power allows it to remember. But what if some of the darkest chapters were never meant to be seen at all? Imagine a sacred world where priestesses once held influence, guided rituals, interpreted omens, and served as voices between the divine and the mortal. Now imagine what happened when the same institutions that once honored them began to fear them. Here is the unsettling truth that forces a deeper question. Why did the accusations of heresy against these women rise exactly when their authority threatened established hierarchies? This is not a comfortable question, but it is the one that opens the door to understanding why so much of their story disappeared behind sealed manuscripts and censored chronicles. In ancient sanctuaries, the presence of a woman with spiritual authority disrupted a landscape built on obedience and centralization. Her influence over communities made her a target, yet official histories rarely admit this. Instead, they describe vague transgressions, unexplained rituals, or supposed deviations from doctrine. But if you look closely, you see the pattern. These accusations were not born from divine revelations. They were crafted, line by men who felt their own authority slipping away. And once the accusation appeared, everything else followed with terrifying speed. The priestess was isolated, stripped of her role, and transformed from a spiritual guide into a symbol of danger. What makes this even more disturbing is how meticulously these events were hidden. Records were rewritten, testimonies vanished, and the narrative shifted from admiration to suspicion almost overnight. And if you have ever felt that something in a story did not add up, that an official version seemed too polished, too convenient, you already know the feeling that these women carried. Their lives became warnings, their voices buried under layers of fear, manipulation, and ritualized violence. You might even ask yourself whether you have seen this pattern in other moments of history or even in your own life. Has authority ever rewritten the truth to protect itself? Have you ever witnessed someone powerful silence a voice simply because it challenged their comfort? If this resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments because understanding this kind of manipulation changes the way we read every historical narrative. And while you are here, make sure to like this video and check if you are already subscribed to the channel so you do not miss the rest of this investigation. What comes next will connect the hidden motives behind these accusations with the brutal consequences that followed, revealing how fear dressed itself as righteousness to destroy those who stood in its way. The rise of the first accusations against priestesses did not happen suddenly. It unfolded in quiet corridors, whispered meetings, and subtle shifts in religious language that gradually redrew the boundaries of what was considered acceptable spiritual authority. In the early stages, nothing appeared openly hostile. Leaders spoke of the need for doctrinal purity or the danger of unregulated rituals. But beneath those polished phrases, a calculated objective was already taking shape. The influence of women who held sacred roles was being reframed as a potential threat, and the slightest deviation in behavior could be interpreted as a sign of heresy. What once made these women essential to communal life now became ammunition for their downfall. Many of the earliest accusations came from ambiguous testimonies that could be shaped to fit any narrative. A gesture during a ceremony, a symbolic interpretation of an omen, a moment of spiritual ecstasy during a rite, all could be twisted into proof of forbidden practices. And because these priestesses operated close to the mysteries of their traditions, their actions were already difficult to explain to those outside the ritual sphere. This ambiguity worked perfectly for those who wanted to dismantle their authority. A suggestion became a suspicion. A suspicion became a charge. And a charge, once recorded, carried the weight of divine judgment, whether or not it had any foundation in truth. The political environment surrounding these accusations added another layer of danger. Religious leaders were competing not only for influence over doctrines, but also for control over the social structures that defined power. A priestess with strong, communal ties represented a kind of legitimacy that male authorities could not easily replicate. She embodied continuity with older traditions, many of which predated the hierarchies now trying to dominate spiritual life. Eliminating her was not just an act of punishment, but an attempt to break the cultural memory she carried. The accusation of heresy conveniently offered a moral justification for this erasure, allowing leaders to portray themselves as defenders of the faith while consolidating control. Over time, the accusations took on a ritualized structure. They began with anonymous complaints, followed by formal inquiries that pre-selected evidence supporting the desired outcome. Questions were designed to corner the accused, and witnesses were chosen not for their reliability, but for their willingness to affirm the suspicions that had already been decided. Each step gave the appearance of a fair process, masking the reality that the verdict was predetermined. This procedure created an illusion of righteousness that was crucial for maintaining public support. People were more easily persuaded when punishment looked like divine necessity rather than political strategy. What makes this period particularly revealing is how quickly these narratives spread. Rumors became doctrines, and doctrines turned into rules enforced by fear. Communities that once welcomed the guidance of priestesses began distancing themselves, afraid that any association might draw suspicion onto them as well. The shift happened gradually enough that many did not notice it, yet forcefully enough to alter the entire perception of female spiritual authority. This transformation laid the groundwork for even harsher measures that would come next, as the accusations began to justify increasingly severe forms of control and punishment. Once the accusations took hold, the next step was the systematic isolation of the priestess. This was not done impulsively or chaotically. It followed a method refined over generations, a method designed to break a woman not through open violence at first, but through calculated removal from everything that once affirmed her identity. The process began with limiting her access to ritual spaces, prohibiting her from performing ceremonies she had led for years, and quietly instructing her followers to keep their distance. The community, once guided by her presence, now looked at her with uncertainty planted by the very leaders, orchestrating her downfall. This initial isolation served as the psychological foundation for what was to come, weakening her support and leaving her vulnerable to harsher forms of interrogation. The interrogation itself was often framed as a spiritual examination, a test of purity, or an attempt to uncover doctrinal deviation. But these noble labels concealed a deeply manipulative strategy. The priestess would be questioned for hours, sometimes days, by individuals who already believed, or pretended to believe, that she had deviated from sacred law. They did not seek clarity, they sought contradiction. A pause could be interpreted as hesitation. A memory lapse could be called concealment. A moment of emotional fatigue could be transformed into evidence of guilt. And because these interrogations were conducted without witnesses, the words spoken inside those dim chambers were shaped later into whatever version strengthened the case against her. Over time, a pattern emerged in the testimonies used to justify further punishment. Interrogators claimed the priestess had performed unauthorized rituals, communicated with forbidden entities, or influenced the spiritual lives of others in ways that challenged established doctrine. These accusations were vague enough to adapt to any situation, yet dramatic enough to stir fear in the community. By the time the interrogation concluded, the narrative surrounding her had shifted completely. She was no longer a respected spiritual guide but a perceived threat who had crossed into dangerous territory. This shift made the next phase possible, her transformation into a public symbol of disobedience. The process of public degradation was not only a punishment, it was a strategic message directed at anyone who might question religious authority. The priestess was often displayed before the community in a way that stripped her of dignity. Ritual garments that once signified her sacred role were replaced with plain or damaged clothing, emphasizing her supposed fall from grace. Leaders used carefully crafted speeches to describe her actions not as misunderstood decisions, but as deliberate rebellions against divine order. Each detail served to reshape her identity, pulling her further from her previous role and deeper into the category of an outcast. What made this phase particularly cruel was how it exploited the emotional bond between the priestess and the community she once served. People who had trusted her for guidance now questioned their own memories. The more they doubted themselves, the more easily they accepted the version presented by authority. The priestess, meanwhile, witnessed her life being dismantled piece by piece, not through sudden brutality, but through slow, suffocating erasure. The methods used to dehumanize her created an environment where the most extreme measures would soon appear justified, setting the stage for punishments designed not only to remove her, but to reshape the entire spiritual landscape around her. As the public degradation intensified, religious leaders escalated their tactics by introducing punishments that were deliberately theatrical. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were rituals of control meant to display the consequences of defying spiritual authority. The punishments often took place in open courtyards or near temple entrances, where community members gathered for ceremonies. What once had been spaces of reverence and unity were transformed into stages of humiliation. The priestess, already weakened by isolation and interrogation, was forced to stand in front of the same people who once sought her blessings. Each gesture, each word from the officials, reinforced the message that she had fallen irreversibly from grace. These spectacles were carefully structured. Religious leaders opened the ritual with proclamations of divine justice, framing the punishment as necessary for the purification of the community. They described the priestess's alleged transgressions in dramatic terms, emphasizing her supposed corruption of sacred rites or her deviation from established doctrine. The audience was encouraged not to think critically, but to feel morally obligated to reject her. The environment relied heavily on emotion, creating a psychological atmosphere where dissent seemed dangerous and compliance felt like virtue. Even those who secretly doubted the accusations rarely dared to voice their discomfort. Physical humiliation was often combined with symbolic gestures meant to sever the priestess from her former identity. Sacred ornaments she once wore were broken or burned. Ritual objects associated with her role were destroyed in front of the crowd. In some regions, her hair was cut in public, a gesture that was both punitive and deeply symbolic, stripping away the markers of spiritual authority. These actions were not only meant to degrade her, but to tarnish the very idea of female spiritual leadership. The goal was to make her example unforgettable, imprinting the fear of similar punishment onto every woman who might consider exercising influence within religious spaces. What made these rituals even more devastating was the way they weaponized communal participation. Members of the community were sometimes required to verbally condemn the priestess, even if they felt conflicted. In other cases, they were encouraged to reenact gestures of rejection, such as turning their backs or casting symbolic stones. Authority figures understood that forcing the community to participate created a shared sense of guilt and responsibility. Once people acted against someone they once admired, they became invested in believing the punishment was justified. Otherwise, they would have to confront the discomfort of their own involvement. This psychological mechanism ensured that the narrative of her guilt would remain unchallenged long after the punishment ended. As the ritual concluded, leaders delivered long speeches warning the community of the dangers of disobedience, deviations in ritual conduct, or challenges to established hierarchy. Their tone suggested concern for spiritual order, but the underlying intention was unmistakable: to consolidate power by making an example out of a woman who once stood as a symbol of sacred knowledge. the punishment became a form of historical rewriting, turning her from a figure of reverence into a cautionary tale shaped entirely by those who sought to erase her influence. If any part of this ritualized humiliation makes you reflect on how power manipulates public perception, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps uncover how these patterns still echo across time, shaping the way stories are told and remembered. Behind the grand displays of punishment, another strategy unfolded quietly within the inner chambers of religious authority. Leaders who sought to eliminate priestesses understood that physical humiliation alone was not enough. They needed a doctrinal framework, something that appeared sacred and unquestionable to justify their actions. This is where the reinterpretation of sacred texts became a powerful weapon. Verses that once celebrated women's spiritual roles were gradually reframed or selectively quoted to support the idea that female influence posed a danger to divine order. Passages originally written in symbolic language were twisted into literal mandates and ambiguities, were emphasized in ways that cast suspicion on women who held religious power. These distortions were rarely done openly. Instead, they appeared in sermons, commentaries, and teaching sessions led by influential men who understood how deeply the community trusted their interpretations. The more these altered explanations spread, the more they shaped public consciousness. Soon, the community began to believe that priestesses were not just deviants, but potential disruptors of cosmic balance. Even minor ritual variations could be portrayed as evidence of spiritual corruption. Once these ideas took root, it became nearly impossible for a priestess to defend herself. The very texts she once relied on for guidance had been weaponized against her. This shift in doctrine served another purpose. It created a moral justification that masked political motives. Religious leaders who feared losing influence found in these distorted teachings a convenient tool to suppress competition. A priestess, with strong community ties, deep ritual knowledge, and generational respect, represented a rival form of authority. By portraying her as a heretic, leaders not only removed that threat, but also presented themselves as protectors of the faith. The community, unaware of the political undercurrent, accepted these teachings as spiritual truth. And once an idea is accepted as sacred, challenging it feels like challenging the divine itself. Over time, these reinterpretations began to reshape the cultural landscape. Parents taught their children to distrust women who showed signs of spiritual insight. Ritual traditions passed down through matrilineal lines were dismissed as dangerous, even if they had been practiced peacefully for centuries. Entire branches of spiritual knowledge were abandoned, not because they lacked value, but because they became associated with supposed heresy. In this environment, any woman who exhibited strong intuition, healing abilities, or ritual skill risked being viewed with suspicion. The legacy of priestesses did not disappear quickly. It was slowly overwritten by narratives that made their contributions seem threatening rather than sacred. What makes this pattern particularly revealing is how seamlessly it blended into everyday religious life. People did not notice that interpretations were changing. The shifts felt natural, logical, and morally justified because they were presented gradually, wrapped in the language of devotion. Communities believed they were protecting themselves from spiritual danger, not realizing they were participating in the erasure of their own history. Meanwhile, the leaders responsible for these distortions strengthened their position, shaping a system where spiritual authority ran in only one direction. This ideological transformation paved the way for even more devastating actions, as the groundwork was now set for judgments that would no longer need justification, but would instead be accepted as inevitable. Once doctrine had been reshaped to justify suspicion, the machinery of judgment moved into its most concealed and dangerous phase. Public humiliation might have served to warn the community, but the decisive blows against a priestess were delivered behind closed doors, in secret councils where only a handful of influential leaders were permitted to speak. These gatherings were presented as solemn inquiries, guided by sacred duty, yet their purpose was far from impartial. The verdict had often been decided long before the accused even entered the chamber. What remained was the ritual of legitimizing her downfall in a way that would appear orderly, righteous, and sanctioned by divine will. The priestess, stripped of support and exhausted by previous interrogations, was brought before a panel that claimed to represent spiritual wisdom, but the questions she faced were crafted to corner her, not to uncover truth. They shifted from abstract theological matters to interpretations of her behavior, then to accusations framed as moral obligations. If she answered with confidence, she was accused of arrogance. If she hesitated, they argued she was hiding something. Silence was taken as defiance. Emotion was taken as guilt. Every response became evidence against her, feeding a narrative constructed long before she arrived. These sessions were not courts. They were performances designed to secure a predetermined confession. Confessions, of course, were essential. Without them, even manipulated doctrine could be questioned. So leaders used a range of tactics to extract statements that could be interpreted as admissions of wrongdoing. Some priestesses were pressured to accept vague charges, told it was the only path toward spiritual forgiveness. Others were coerced into repeating words they did not believe, simply to end the psychological torment of unending questioning. And when these methods failed, the script was adjusted. Interrogators claimed that divine insight allowed them to sense her guilt, making confessions unnecessary. What mattered was not truth, but the appearance of justice upheld in the eyes of the community. Once the council declared her guilt, the next stage involved erasing the legacy she had built. Records mentioning her contributions were altered or removed. Ritual practices she once led were assigned to others or abandoned entirely. In some places, elders rewrote portions of local history to portray her as misguided from the beginning, as if her supposed fall had always been inevitable. Songs, stories, and teachings associated with her lineage were recast as dangerous remnants of a corrupted tradition. This revision of memory ensured that future generations would not question the judgment passed against her. It was not enough to punish the priestess. Her entire spiritual footprint had to be wiped away. The people closest to her were pressured into distancing themselves. Students denied having learned from her. Families avoided mentioning her name. Those who dared to defend her risked being seen as sympathizers of heresy. The social atmosphere made it nearly impossible to resist the official narrative. And as the priestess faded from public memory, the leaders who orchestrated her destruction strengthened their hold on the community. Their authority appeared more unified, more orderly, and more divinely sanctioned than ever before, even though it had been built upon deliberate erasure. Yet, beneath the surface, something remained unsettled. The abrupt disappearance of a respected spiritual figure created a subtle but enduring unease. Rituals felt different, traditions became rigid, and the silent gaps in communal memory hinted at truths that had been forcibly removed. This unease would set the stage for the harsher, more brutal responses that awaited those who dared to resist the new order. As the machinery of secrecy tightened, the punishments imposed on priestesses accused of heresy crossed into territories even the community could barely comprehend. What had begun as ritualized humiliation and doctrinal manipulation now escalated into brutal acts designed not only to eliminate the accused, but to instill lasting terror in anyone who might question authority. These were punishments carried out far from public courtyards, in hidden chambers, abandoned sanctuaries, or remote structures where no witness outside the council would ever be allowed. The secrecy itself amplified the horror, because no one knew exactly what happened, only that those taken inside rarely returned unchanged, if they returned at all. The brutal techniques varied from one region to another, but all shared a common purpose: to break the priestess physically, psychologically, and spiritually. Some were subjected to long periods of sensory deprivation, a method intended to erode their sense of reality. Others were forced into ritual positions for hours, their bodies pushed to extremes under the guise of extracting truth. In certain cases, physical torture was cloaked in symbolic explanations. Leaders claimed the pain represented purification or divine testing, but the real intention was to create lasting damage that could be interpreted as the mark of guilt. A priestess weakened, disoriented, or scarred became living proof of the accusations, reinforcing the narrative created by those who sought to destroy her. The greatest cruelty lay not only in the brutality itself, but in the silence surrounding it. Those who survived these ordeals were often too traumatized to speak, and even if they tried, their words were dismissed as the confused ramblings of someone spiritually corrupted. Meanwhile, the leaders responsible for these tortures crafted stories to justify the priestess's condition. They claimed she had resisted purification or revealed frightening signs during ritual examination. Each fabricated detail widened the distance between her former identity and the narrative imposed upon her, making it nearly impossible for the community to see her as anything other than a danger. Disappearances were even more effective. Some priestesses were taken under the pretext of further inquiry and never returned. Official records noted their removal from service, but gave no cause, no explanation, and no acknowledgement of what had happened. The absence of information created an atmosphere of dread, and the unknown became a weapon in its own right. People whispered theories, each more terrifying than the last, and these rumors reinforced the authority of the leaders who claimed they were protecting the community from unseen threats. In this environment, even questioning the fate of a missing priestess felt like a step toward heresy. What made these cases so haunting was how thoroughly they were erased from historical memory. Chronicles omitted names. Ritual manuals excised references to female traditions. Oral histories broke apart under the weight of fear. And yet, fragments survived in unexpected places, coded symbols carved into temple stones, forgotten songs passed between women, or scattered testimonies recorded in private journals. These remnants hint at the scale of brutality that official records sought to bury. They reveal not isolated incidents, but a coordinated effort to eliminate entire traditions of female spiritual authority. If any part of this makes you reflect on how easily truth can be silenced or rewritten, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps illuminate the echoes of these forgotten stories and the ways they shape the spiritual world for generations. The removal of priestesses from spiritual life did more than silence individual women. It triggered a slow collapse of entire cultural worlds built around their presence. For generations, these women had served as guardians of rituals that blended memory, land, and community into a living tradition. They knew the songs sung only at certain phases of the moon, the blessings whispered over newborns, the prayers offered before harvest, storms, or illness. When they disappeared, those practices did not simply transfer neatly to new hands. Many of them withered in place, cut off from the lineages that had sustained them. What remained was a spiritual structure that still looked familiar on the surface, but felt strangely hollow beneath. This hollowing out was subtle at first. Ceremonies still happened. Temples still opened their doors. Festivals were still celebrated according to the calendar, but the texture of these events changed. Where priestesses once guided the emotional rhythm of rituals, weaving care, wisdom, and embodied experience into each gesture, the new officiants focused more on rigid form and doctrinal precision. The warmth of lived tradition was replaced by the coldness of strict enforcement. People still attended, yet many felt a quiet distance growing between themselves and the sacred, spaces they once experienced as extensions of their own lives. The removal of female spiritual voices had drained away nuances that could not easily be named, only felt. This transformation extended beyond ritual into the stories people told about the world. Myths that once centered powerful women, keepers of thresholds, interpreters of dreams, guardians of seasonal cycles, were retold with altered emphasis. Some of these figures were softened into passive symbols. Others were reimagined as cautionary examples punished for ambition or disobedience. Over time, entire generations grew up hearing a version of the sacred narrative where women rarely appeared as bearers of wisdom and almost never as legitimate authorities. Spiritual imagination itself narrowed, shaping how people understood not just the divine, but their own possibilities within it. The absence of priestesses also reshaped the way communities related to their environment. Many of these women had carried knowledge tied to local landscapes, springs considered healing, groves treated as living sanctuaries, seasonal markers observed long before written calendars. When their knowledge was dismissed as superstition or heresy, those connections weakened. Sacred sites were abandoned, repurposed or desacralized. Fields once blessed according to ancient rhythms were now managed purely for production. Forests once guarded by ritual taboo became vulnerable to exploitation. The loss of female-led traditions did not just affect religious life. It altered the relationship between people, land, and time. Within families, the impact was just as profound. Practices once passed quietly from mothers and grandmothers, small altars in the home, protective chants, rituals for grief, fertility, and transition, were discouraged or condemned. Women who tried to preserve them risked being associated with the same accusations that had destroyed the priestesses. Many stopped teaching these customs openly, and some abandoned them entirely out of fear. With each broken link, invisible threads that had held communities together loosened. What looked from the outside like a more controlled, unified religious system was, in reality, a network of fractures held together by fear rather than shared meaning. Despite all of this, traces of the old ways refused to disappear completely. Fragments survived in songs sung at the edge of official ceremonies, in gestures made quietly before formal prayers, in herbs gathered, according to patterns no one could fully explain. These remnants acted like faint echoes of a deeper memory, reminders that something had existed before the current order. They persisted, not because they were authorized, but because they still met needs that official doctrine could not entirely satisfy. The need for comfort in times of loss, for connection to the unseen, for a sense that the sacred was not confined to distant authorities, but also lived in the daily rhythm of ordinary lives. As the cultural landscape shifted, the social consequences of transforming sacred women into symbols of danger began to unfold in ways that reshaped entire communities. The removal of priestesses did not merely alter rituals or doctrine. It redefined how people understood authority, morality, and even themselves. Once a priestess was declared a heretic, her downfall became a narrative tool, repeated in sermons, domestic teachings, and communal stories. Children grew up hearing that a woman who stepped too deeply into spiritual knowledge risked corruption. Adults internalized the idea that female intuition, once respected, was now suspect. An invisible boundary had been drawn, and crossing it seemed to invite disaster. This reconditioning had far-reaching effects on social roles. Women who might have pursued spiritual training, healing arts, or leadership in communal rites now hesitated, fearing that ambition alone could be interpreted as rebellion. The possibility of being misunderstood, or worse, intentionally targeted, created an atmosphere where silence felt safer than participation. Even in families that privately respected female spirituality, the weight of public expectation suppressed expression. The transformation from sacred guide to potential threat had been so effectively imposed that generations accepted it without realizing how deliberately it had been engineered. Communities that once depended on the guidance of priestesses found themselves increasingly reliant on centralized authority. Decisions that had been made collectively or with the insight of female elders now flowed from a smaller group of male leaders whose interpretations carried absolute weight. This shift created a dependency that reinforced the power structure responsible for the erasures in the first place. Any challenge to this hierarchy appeared not as a difference in perspective, but as a danger to spiritual stability. In this environment, the memory of priestesses became distorted shadows, invoked only as examples of what the community must avoid. These consequences extended into the emotional and psychological lives of women. Many experienced a subtle sense of dislocation, as if part of their ancestral identity had been severed. Knowledge that had once been shared openly, how to comfort the grieving, how to read symbolic signs in nature, how to maintain harmony within the household, now carried an unspoken stigma. Women who felt drawn to these practices had to navigate an internal conflict between inherited memory and imposed fear. Over time, this tension created an undercurrent of quiet loneliness, a sense that something essential had been lost but could not be named. Men, too, were affected, though in ways less immediately visible. Without the balancing presence of female spiritual authority, rituals grew more rigid and doctrine more absolute. Emotional expression became narrower, confined to structures that emphasized obedience rather than connection. The absence of priestesses removed not only a source of wisdom, but also a form of relational guidance that had helped maintain equilibrium within sacred spaces. Communities became more hierarchical, more anxious, and more dependent on fear-based narratives to maintain cohesion. Across entire regions, the transformation of priestesses into enemies of the temple reshaped spiritual imagination itself. The divine became associated with surveillance rather than mystery, with punishment rather than insight. People learned to approach the sacred with caution instead of curiosity, with guilt instead of reverence. This cultural shift left deep marks on how individuals related to their beliefs, their communities, and their own inner worlds. Yet even amid this transformation, traces of the old identity persisted in subtle gestures, in half-remembered stories, in the quiet resilience of women who carried fragments of ancestral memory. These silent remnants suggested that what had been erased was not truly gone, only waiting beneath the surface, hidden but not extinguished. In the end, what happened to priestesses accused of heresy is not just a sequence of cruel events buried in forgotten records. It is a mirror held up to the mechanisms of fear, control, and erasure that have shaped how we understand the past. These women once stood at the center of spiritual life, guiding rituals, interpreting signs, and embodying a form of sacred authority that did not fit neatly into later hierarchies. When power decided that their presence was no longer convenient, it did not merely remove them, it rewrote the meaning of their existence. Their voices were recast as dangerous, their wisdom recoded as deviation, and their suffering reframed as necessary sacrifice for the so-called purity of the community. Yet if you look closely, the very effort it took to silence them reveals how important they truly were. No one invests so much energy in destroying what is insignificant. The isolation, the interrogations, the rewoven doctrines, the brutal punishments, the careful rewriting of memory, all of this signals that these priestesses represented something authority could not easily absorb or control. They carried alternative ways of relating to the sacred, to the body, to the land, and to each other. Their elimination did not simply close a chapter, it narrowed the path along which entire civilizations were allowed to imagine the divine. The traces that survived, hidden in songs, symbols, and forgotten fragments of testimony, remind us that history is not a fixed monument, but a contested field. What you were taught as unquestionable fact may, in reality, be only one version of events, selected and polished by those who benefited most from its survival. When you begin to question why certain stories were amplified while others were silenced, you start to see the outlines of everything that was pushed into the shadows. And within those shadows, the figures of these priestesses still stand, not as villains or cautionary tales, but as witnesses to a spiritual world that was deliberately dismantled. If you arrived here, it means you walked through that shadowed corridor and allowed yourself to confront what was done to them. That already sets you apart from the many who prefer the comfort of simplified narratives. If this content helped you see these forgotten women differently, take a moment to let me know in the comments by writing a simple phrase like, "I stayed with this story until the end," or, "This message was for me." Your words do more than register engagement. They help keep these buried histories alive in a space where they were never meant to be remembered. And if you felt that this journey had value, make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you can continue exploring these hidden layers of the past with me. Check if the subscribe button is active for you, and leave a like on this video so the platform understands that these stories matter and should be shown to more people. There is another video here on the side that complements this one, and opens a new door into the darker corners of ancient and medieval history. Click and keep going with me there, carrying with you the awareness that behind every official version of the past, there are voices that fought not to disappear completely,